Gideon Blackwell didn't just reject her. He threw a gold coin at her feet in front of the entire town, like she was a stray dog he was tossing a scrap to. Clara Whitmore had traveled 1,000 miles on the strength of his promises, believed every word of his careful letters, and been honest with him about everything, including her face. And this was his answer. But the woman he humiliated on that platform was not going to disappear quietly. If you've ever been written off by someone who had no idea what you were worth, hit like and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe and follow Clara's story to the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The gold coin hit the platform boards and spun twice before it fell flat. Clara Whitmore heard it land before she understood what was happening. She had been watching Gideon Blackwell's face, watching the exact moment his expression shifted from polite anticipation to something that looked almost like disgust. And she was still trying to make sense of that shift when he reached into his vest pocket, produced the coin, and tossed it at her feet with the casual ease of a man dropping a scrap to a stray dog. "For your trouble," he said. The words were quiet. That was what she would remember later, in the weeks and months that followed. Not the volume of them, but the flatness. He said it the way a man says good morning or pass the salt, like it required no particular thought, like she required no particular thought. The Abilene Depot platform was not empty. It was never empty at 2:30 on a Tuesday, not with the cattle trade running the way it was, and half the town treating the train schedule like a social calendar. Clara had noticed the onlookers when she stepped off the train. A cluster of men near the freight car, 2 women in bonnets standing by the ticket window, a boy of maybe 12 sitting on a barrel eating something out of his shirt pocket. She had noticed them and told herself it didn't matter, that she was here for one reason and one reason only, and the size of the audience was irrelevant. She was regretting that logic now. Gideon Blackwell was exactly what his letters had suggested. Broad across the shoulders, well-dressed, the kind of man who had learned early that a firm handshake and a direct gaze could carry a person a long way in the world. He was not unhandsome. He had written her careful, considered letters for 4 months, letters that spoke of his cattle operation and his late wife and his belief that a woman's character mattered more than her circumstances. He had read her letters in return, letters in which she had been, she believed, scrupulously honest. She had told him about the birthmark. She had described it plainly. Left side of her face, from her cheekbone down to her jaw, darker than her skin, and impossible to miss. She had not apologized for it. She had simply told him it was there, and she had waited, and he had written back and said, "I am not a man who puts stock in surfaces, Miss Whitmore. I have known too much loss to be so foolish." She had believed him. Standing on that platform with a gold coin spinning at her feet and 30 or 40 people watching, she understood the full cost of that belief. "I don't want your money," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that, at least. Gideon's jaw tightened. Not with embarrassment. She could read the difference, and this was not embarrassment. This was irritation. The irritation of a man who had expected a transaction to proceed cleanly and was now finding it complicated by the other party's refusal to cooperate. "Take it," he said. "Get yourself a meal and a ticket back east. There's no cause for unpleasantness. You're the one who threw money at me in front of a train station full of people. I offered you compensation for an inconvenient journey. That's a reasonable thing to do." "It's not reasonable," Clara said. "It's insulting, and you know it." A sound moved through the small crowd. Not a gasp exactly, more like a collective intake of breath, the sound people make when something they expected to be brief and forgettable suddenly becomes worth watching. Clara felt it register in her spine. She did not look at the onlookers. She kept her eyes on Gideon's face because she had learned a long time ago that looking away from a person who was trying to diminish you was the fastest way to let them succeed. "Miss Whitmore." He lowered his voice. That was interesting. The first sign that he was aware of the audience, that some part of him understood how this looked. "I think we both know this arrangement was premature. A man in my position has obligations to consider. I have a reputation in this community. Your letters didn't mention your reputation. My letters were written in good faith. Were they?" It wasn't a question. She didn't mean it as one. His nostrils flared. He was a man who was not accustomed to being interrupted. She could see that clearly, and he was even less accustomed to being interrupted by a woman who was supposed to be at a disadvantage. I think it would be best for everyone if you simply... You wrote me 4 months of letters, Clara said. You told me you valued character over circumstance. You told me you'd buried a wife, and that loss had taught you what mattered in a person. You asked me to be honest about myself, and I was. I told you about my face. I described it to you plainly. You wrote back and said it didn't concern you. Silence on the platform. Even the boy on the barrel had stopped eating. That was, I may have spoken imprecisely. You lied, Clara said. The word landed like something dropped from a height. Gideon Blackwell's face went through several changes very quickly. Surprise, anger, a flicker of something that might have been shame, and then the hardening that comes when a man decides shame is an emotion he cannot afford in public. I'm being generous, he said, and his voice had gone cold now, the pleasantness entirely gone. I could have you escorted off my property. I could have made this far more difficult. I'm offering you money, and I'm asking you to leave quietly, and I think you ought to take that offer before I change my mind. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had looked at a lot of things over the course of her 31 years. Poverty, illness, the death of her mother, the particular cruelty of people who believed that a visible difference in a woman's face was a moral failing. With the steady, assessing gaze of a person who had decided a long time ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Then she bent down and picked up the gold coin. She turned it over in her fingers once. Then she set it on the platform railing with a precise, deliberate click. Keep it, she said. You clearly need it more than I do. She picked up her suitcase. It was not a light suitcase. It held everything she owned, and carrying it required effort. But she carried it without visible effort, because she had been carrying heavy things her whole life, and she had learned how to make the weight look like nothing. She walked away from Gideon Blackwell and his audience and his cold voice and his coin on the railing, and she did not look back, because looking back would have cost her the only thing she had managed to hold on to. The platform gave way to the unpaved main street of Abilene, and the September sun was brutal and direct, and Clara walked until she found a spot between a livery stable and a dry goods store where the shadow was deep enough to stop in, and she set down her suitcase and pressed her back against the wall and let herself breathe. She was 31 years old. She had exactly $4.60 in her skirt pocket, a return ticket she couldn't afford to use for another 2 weeks, no acquaintances within 500 miles, and a face that a man had just publicly declared reason enough to abandon a 4-month correspondence and a formal engagement agreement. She stood in the shadow between the livery and the dry goods store and breathed, and she did not cry, because crying had never once made anything better in her experience, and she was not about to start giving it credit now. What she needed was a plan. She had come to Kansas with one plan, and that plan had lasted approximately 45 seconds past the moment of Gideon Blackwell's first look at her. She needed another one. She was good at plans, better than most people gave her credit for, which was true of most of her abilities, as far as she could tell. She had kept her mother's household running for 3 years after her father left. She had learned to cook, to mend, to manage money with the kind of precision that came from there never being enough of it. She had taught herself to read French from a dictionary she found at a church sale, not because she had any particular use for French, but because she had decided she was going to keep learning things until the world ran out of things to teach her. None of that had been enough to prevent what just happened on that platform. But it was what she had, and she was going to work with what she had. The livery stable door opened, and a man walked out leading a bay horse. He glanced at her with mild curiosity. A woman standing in the shadow with a suitcase at her feet was unusual enough to merit a look. And then he looked more carefully, and his gaze snagged on the left side of her face the way people's gazes always did. And then he looked away. She was accustomed to that too, the looking and the looking away, the brief recalibration. She had been accustomed to it since she was old enough to understand what people were looking at. She needed work. That was the first thing. She had enough money for a few nights at a boarding house, but not enough to sustain her while she figured out her next move. And her next move required figuring out because going back to Philadelphia with nothing but a failed engagement and a coin she hadn't taken felt like a particular variety of defeat she wasn't prepared to accept. She had skills. She could cook. She could clean. She could sew. She could keep accounts. These were not glamorous skills, but they were real ones. And in a cattle town in Kansas in 1878, there was almost certainly someone who needed them. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the dry goods store. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her 50s, with the kind of face that had been attractive once and had aged into something more interesting. Strong-boned, watchful, the lines around her eyes the kind you get from squinting into weather rather than from worrying. She looked up when Clara came in, did the snagging thing with her eyes, and then did something most people didn't do. She looked back up at Clara's eyes and kept her attention there. "Help you?" "I'm looking for work," Clara said. "Any kind. I can cook, keep house, manage accounts, sew. I'm not particular about the nature of the work, but I'd need to start immediately." The woman studied her for a moment. "You just got off the train." "I did." "You're the woman Gideon Blackwell was supposed to be meeting." Clara had been in enough small towns to know that word traveled fast, but the speed of it in Abilene was still slightly startling. "I am." The woman seemed to be thinking. "I don't have work to offer, but my neighbor Prue runs the boarding house on Maple Street. She's been looking for kitchen help since her last girl married a drover and left. It doesn't pay much." "I don't need much." "You'd want to talk to her yourself. I'll write you her address." She pulled a pencil from behind her ear with the ease of long practice. "I'm Ruth Garrett, if she asks who sent you." "Clara Whitmore." Clara paused. "Thank you. Most people are more interested in a story than in helping," Ruth Garrett said. "I've been the subject of enough stories in my time to know the difference." She handed over the slip of paper. "Prue's a fair woman. Don't let the boarders intimidate you. Half of them are cowboys, and the other half wish they were." Prudence Alcott's boarding house was a narrow two-story building that had been painted white at some point in the past decade and was now the color of old cream. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and someone had propped it up with a piece of timber that was doing its best. Clara knocked on the front door and was admitted by a girl of about 14 with flour on her apron and a preoccupied expression. "Mrs. Alcott's in the kitchen," the girl said, already heading back in that direction. "You can follow me, I suppose." The kitchen was large and hot and smelled of bread and something with onions. Prudence Alcott was a small, vigorous woman of about 60 who moved through her kitchen the way experienced cooks move through familiar territory, efficiently, without wasted motion, knowing where everything was without needing to look. She turned when Clara came in, assessed her in a single sweeping glance, and said, "You cook?" "Yes." "From scratch, or do you need a recipe for everything?" "From scratch, mostly. I have a good memory for recipes I've read once." "Bake bread?" "Yes." "Biscuits?" "Yes." "Can you manage a kitchen full of hungry men at 6 in the morning without losing your temper?" "I've managed worse things without losing my temper." Prudence Alcott looked at her for another moment. Her gaze moved briefly to Clara's face, not furtively, but directly. The way a person looks at something they have noted and filed and are not going to make a production of, and then returned to Clara's eyes. $3 a week, meals included, and you share a room with Dottie." "That's Dottie?" Clara gestured toward the direction the flour-covered girl had gone. "That's Dottie. She's useful, but she's young, and she gets distracted. You'd be keeping her on task as much as anything." "I can do that." "Breakfast at 6, supper at 7, midday meal for whoever's around. Sundays you get the afternoon off." She turned back to her stove. "You can start tomorrow morning. Tonight you get your room and supper included." "Mrs. Alcott," Clara said. "Ruth Garrett sent me. I don't know if that matters to you." "Ruth Garrett is a sensible woman," Prudence said. "I'll trust her judgment till she gives me reason not to." She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "Go find Dottie, and she'll show you where you're sleeping." Clara went to find Dottie with the particular feeling of a person who has just avoided, by the narrowest of margins, a very different and much worse day. The room she shared with Dottie was small, with 2 narrow beds and a window that faced the back of the building. Clara set her suitcase on the floor beside the bed closer to the door and sat down on the mattress and listened to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Voices from the common room, the clatter of dishes being cleared, someone's boots on the stairs. It was not the life she had traveled to Kansas for. It was not the life she had imagined for herself when she read Gideon Blackwell's careful letters by lamplight in her cramped Philadelphia room and thought, carefully and deliberately, that this might be the beginning of something different. But it was a life. It was a place to sleep and food to eat and work she was capable of doing. She had built from less before. She unpacked her suitcase with the methodical efficiency she brought to all practical tasks, hanging her 2 good dresses on the hooks behind the door and folding her other things into the small chest at the foot of the bed. She kept her mother's photograph on top of the chest where she could see it. Her mother had been a plain woman, too, in the conventional sense, plain and practical and possessed of a particular bone-deep stubbornness that Clara had inherited like an heirloom. Her mother had made things work in circumstances where most people would have given up, and she had not complained about it, and she had not been celebrated for it, and she had known both of those things and done it anyway. Clara straightened the photograph and went to help Dottie set the supper tables. The boarders were 10 in number that Tuesday evening, 7 men and 3 women, a mix of drovers and traveling merchants, and a school teacher named Miss Hallie, who had arrived from Ohio 3 weeks prior and was still adjusting to the specific varieties of loud that characterized a Kansas cattle town. They filed into the dining room in the staggered way of people who have learned to pace themselves around a shared table, and most of them gave Clara the same sequence of glances she had been receiving all her life, and she moved through the room handing out bread rolls with the efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped waiting for the world to adjust its manners. One of the drovers, a young man with a sunburned neck and the air of someone who had recently decided to try conversation as a social skill, caught her eye as she came around with the bread and said, "You're new." "I am." "What brought you to Abilene?" "Work," Clara said. He seemed to be debating whether to push further, and she could see the exact moment he decided against it. Not out of sensitivity, exactly, but out of the practical understanding that she had not given him an invitation to continue. He took his bread roll and turned back to the man beside him, and Clara moved on around the table. The school teacher, Miss Hallie, caught her arm as she passed. "Don't mind them," she said quietly. "The drovers are all right once they get used to you. It just takes a few days." "I know," Clara said. "This isn't my first boarding house." Miss Hallie blinked. "I suppose it wouldn't be." She released Clara's arm. "Are you all right? I was at the train station this afternoon. I saw what happened." Clara paused. She looked at Miss Hallie, a neat woman of about her own age, with dark eyes and a careful way of holding herself, the way school teachers often held themselves in public, with the particular uprightness of a person who is always aware they are being watched by their students and has decided to make the watching worth something. "I'm all right," Clara said. "What he did was—" "I know what it was." Clara said it without sharpness. She wasn't angry at Miss Hallie, who had meant the thing kindly. "But I've got work tonight and breakfast to prepare before 6 tomorrow, so I'd rather not spend the evening discussing it, if that's all right." Miss Hallie nodded, and her expression was the one people wore when they respected something they hadn't expected. "Of course. I just wanted you to know. Not everyone here thinks the way he does." "I know that too," Clara said. "Most people are somewhere in the middle. They don't mean harm, and they don't go out of their way to prevent it. That's the world." She moved on around the table. Miss Hallie watched her go. She was in the kitchen washing the supper dishes when the back door opened and Dottie came in with a look of suppressed excitement that Clara had already begun to recognize as the girl's default expression when something was happening that she considered more interesting than dishwashing. "There's a man on the porch asking for you," Dottie said. Clara didn't look up from the pot she was scrubbing. "What kind of man?" "A rancher, I think. He was at the train station today, too. I saw him. He's been standing on the porch for about 5 minutes, and he knocked twice and then just waited." "Tell him I'm busy." "He said he'd wait." "Then he'll wait." Dottie hovered for a moment, visibly torn between curiosity and the knowledge that Clara meant what she said. Then she went back out. Clara finished the pot and the 2 remaining pans and dried her hands on the kitchen rag and went to the back door. The man on the porch was not what she had expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was somewhere around 40, she thought, maybe a few years either side of it, with the particular kind of weathered face that came from working outdoors in a place that didn't spare you from the weather. His hat was in his hands. He had very dark eyes, and they were looking at her with an expression she recognized as unusual. Not the flicker and look away of someone startled by her face, and not the forced neutrality of someone trying to demonstrate that they weren't startled. He was simply looking at her, the way a person looks at another person they are trying to assess honestly. "Miss Whitmore?" he said. "I don't know you." "No, my name's Elias Ward. I was at the depot this afternoon. I saw what happened." "A lot of people saw what happened," Clara said. "Most of them went home." "I did too at first." He turned his hat in his hands once, the first sign of any nervousness. "And then I came back." Clara studied him. He was not the kind of man who said things just to fill silence. She could tell that already. Whatever he was here to say, he had decided to say it before he came, and he was working up to it in his own time. She leaned against the doorframe and let him. "I have a ranch," he said, "about 12 miles south. Small operation, it's not much compared to what some men run out here. 230 acres, good water, but I've had a rough couple of years and I'm behind where I should be." He paused. "I have 2 daughters, 6 and 9. Their mother died 14 months ago." "I'm sorry for that," Clara said. "We manage." He said it in the way people said things that were mostly true. "But we don't manage well. I need someone who knows how to run a house, and my girls need a woman who can show them things. Their mother was going to teach them certain things, and she didn't get the chance." Clara waited. "I'm not offering what Blackwell offered," he said. "I'm offering less money and harder work, and a ranch that needs more than I can do alone. And I want to be clear that I understand what I'm asking. You came out here with a specific expectation, and it went badly, and I'm standing on a porch asking you to consider a different arrangement." He met her eyes directly. "But I saw you on that platform. I saw you give the coin back. And I thought, a woman who does that when everything's gone wrong is probably the kind of woman who does what she says she'll do." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You could have said all of that in a letter," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "But a letter takes time, and you might have left, and—" He stopped. "And I don't write letters very well." That surprised her. Not the admission itself, but the ease with which he made it, the absence of defensiveness. Most men she'd known would have found a different way to say that, something that preserved their dignity a little more. He'd just said it. "How old are your daughters?" "Lucy's 9, May's 6. "What are they like?" He thought about it. Not performing the thinking, actually doing it. "Lucy's serious. Worried about everything. She took her mother's death hard in the way serious children do. She decided she was responsible for managing the whole thing. May cries more than Lucy does, but she also laughs more. He stopped again. "May's more like her mother was." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What are you paying?" she said. $5 a month, room and board. If things improve, when things improve, more than that." He held her gaze. "I want to be honest with you about where the ranch is. It's not a comfortable place right now. We're managing, but managing and thriving are different things, and I won't pretend otherwise." "You're doing better than most men who come asking for something," Clara said. "Most of them start with what they're offering and work up to what they need. You started with what you need." He seemed to consider that. "Is that bad?" "No," she said. "It's unusual." She looked past him at the dark street, at the shapes of buildings going black against the blue dark sky. 12 miles south. 2 little girls with a dead mother and a father who apparently couldn't write letters but could at least tell the truth. A ranch that needed work. A life that would be hard. She had been trained by necessity to evaluate hard things without flinching. The question wasn't whether this was going to be easy. Nothing was easy, in her experience, but whether it was going to be real. Whether there was something in it worth working toward. "I'll need to give Mrs. Alcott proper notice," she said. "I can't leave her short-handed without warning." Elias Ward blinked. Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying I'll need to give Mrs. Alcott 2 days' notice, if that's acceptable." "Yes," he said. Yes, that's fine." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not relief exactly, not surprise either, or not only surprise. Something more considered than both of those. I can come back Friday morning. Friday morning, Clara agreed. He nodded once, put his hat back on his head, and stepped off the porch. He had gone about 10 feet before he turned back. Miss Whitmore. She was still leaning in the doorway. What? What you said to him on the platform. He paused. About the coin. That was the right thing. I know it was, she said. That's why I said it. He almost smiled. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, a brief, involuntary thing that he didn't seem to have planned. Then he turned and walked away into the dark street, and Clara went back inside to finish the dishes. Dottie was trying very hard to look like she hadn't been listening from the kitchen doorway. He seems all right, Dottie offered. Bring me that pan, Clara said. Dottie brought the pan. Clara washed it without speaking. After a moment, she said, He has 2 daughters. I heard. Lucy's 9 and May's 6. Dottie waited. Lucy's worried about everything, Clara said, mostly to herself. May laughs. She set the pan in the drying rack and looked out the kitchen window at the dark, and somewhere behind the thought she was thinking there was the ghost of something she hadn't felt in long enough that she didn't immediately recognize it. It took her a moment to identify it, and when she did, she treated it carefully, the way you treat a thing that has been broken before and might break again if you're not careful. Hope, she thought, that's what that is. She didn't trust it yet, but she didn't dismiss it either. She dried her hands and went to find Mrs. Alcott, because she had 2 days' notice to give and she was going to give it properly, because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who did what she said she would do. And on Friday morning, when Elias Ward came back, she would be ready. Friday came with a gray sky and the smell of coming rain, and Clara was standing on the front porch of Prudence Alcott's boarding house with her suitcase at her feet and her coat buttoned to the collar when Elias Ward's wagon came around the corner at 7:10. He was not late by any meaningful measure. She had told him Friday morning, not a specific hour, but she had been ready since 6, because being ready was a habit she'd had since childhood, since the years when being unprepared meant going without something you needed. She watched him pull the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climb down, and she noticed he had a second horse tied to the back, a roan mare with a calm eye, and she thought that was practical of him, bringing the horse rather than having her sit beside him all the way, and then need a horse later. She also noticed he looked like a man who had not slept particularly well. Miss Whitmore, he said, taking the suitcase before she could object to it. You look tired, she said. He lifted the suitcase into the wagon bed without apparent effort. Fence came down in the south pasture last night. I was out fixing it till past midnight. Did you fix it? Well enough to hold until I can do it properly. He went around and untied the roan mare and brought her to the porch steps. She's called Bess. She's steady. You ride? I do, though it's been a few years. Bess won't give you trouble. She's past the age of giving anyone trouble. The mare turned a large, dark eye toward Clara and appeared to be in complete agreement with this assessment of her character. Clara gathered her skirts and mounted, and Bess stood entirely still through the process with the dignified patience of an animal that had been doing this for years and found it neither interesting nor alarming. Prudence Alcott came out onto the porch to see her off. She had said very little when Clara gave her notice, just nodded twice as though filing the information, and said she hoped Clara knew what she was doing. This morning she handed up a cloth-wrapped bundle without explanation. Cornbread, she said, for the road. The girls might like it. Thank you, Mrs. Alcott. Don't thank me, just send word if you need anything. She looked at Elias Ward with the measuring expression of a woman who had housed a lot of men over the years and developed specific opinions about which ones were worth the trouble. Whatever she saw in him appeared to satisfy her minimum requirements. She nodded once and went back inside. They rode out of Abilene with the gray sky pressing down and the first smell of rain getting stronger, and for a while neither of them said anything. Clara had always been comfortable with silence. She considered the compulsion to fill it a kind of social anxiety dressed up as friendliness, and Elias Ward appeared to be the same way. They rode at an easy pace, his wagon on the dirt track and her beside on Bess, and the town fell away behind them and the land opened up the way Kansas land did, flat and enormous and indifferent to human opinion about it, After about 20 minutes, Elias said, I should tell you about the place before we get there. All right. The house is in decent shape. I've kept it weather-tight, fixed the roof last spring, but it's not. My wife had ideas about what she was going to do with it, and she didn't get to do them, so it's still mostly just functional. He paused. I want to say that before you walk in and think I've just let it go. I wouldn't have thought that. Most people would. I'm not most people. He glanced sideways at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of some kind. He looked back at the road. Lucy knows you're coming. May knows you're coming, but she doesn't entirely understand what it means. She keeps asking if you're going to live with us like Aunt Frances lives with the Holloways, and I don't know who Aunt Frances is. What did you tell her? I told her Aunt Frances was probably a fine arrangement, and that, yes, something like that. Clara almost smiled. How did Lucy take it? Elias was quiet for a moment. Lucy said if you were going to cook different than I cook, she needed to know in advance so she could prepare herself. This time Clara did smile, and it surprised her. The speed of it, the involuntary quality of it, like something catching in her chest and pulling up the corners of her mouth before she had given it permission. What do you cook? I cook adequately, sick, he said, with the tone of a man who knows he's understating. Beans, salt pork, eggs when we have them, bread that's technically bread. Technically, it's edible. It's not good bread. May feeds the heels to the chickens, and she's always looked pleased about it. How does May feel about new bread? May will eat almost anything with sufficient enthusiasm to make you feel you've done something remarkable. Lucy will taste it once and reserve judgment and not tell you what the judgment was for approximately 4 days. I grew up with a woman like that, Clara said. My mother. She believed that opinions given too quickly weren't worth having. Was she right? Clara thought about it. About some things. They rode on. The rain held off, though the sky stayed low and gray. The land was starting to change, still flat, but with a particular quality of openness that felt different from the flat of the town, more honest somehow, less managed. A line of cottonwoods marked a creek off to the west, and a hawk was working the thermals over a far rise, and Clara watched it and thought about the fact that she was riding toward a life she had not planned and could not fully picture, following a man she had met 3 days ago, because something in the way he had turned his hat in his hands on a back porch in the dark had seemed to her like evidence of a quality she could work with. She was aware that this was not a conventional way to make decisions. She was also aware that her conventional approach to decisions had landed her on a train platform with a gold coin at her feet, so she was prepared to experiment. Mr. Ward, she said. Elias. Elias. The name felt odd in her mouth, too soon for the familiarity, but he had said it plainly and she wasn't going to argue. Tell me what you need most from this arrangement. Not the house management? I understand that. What do you need most? He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that. My girls need to see a woman manage something, he said finally. Not just cook and clean, though those things matter. I mean, manage something real. Make decisions. Deal with a problem that doesn't have an easy answer. Their mother did that every day, and they saw it, and then she was gone, and the only model they have for how a woman operates in the world is... it's absent. He stopped. I do all right by them, but I can't show them what I can't show them. Clara looked at the horizon and thought about her mother pressing the heels of her hands against the kitchen table when the money ran out. That specific gesture that meant she was working out how to solve a problem she hadn't encountered before. She thought about watching that being 12 years old and watching her mother's hands and understanding without being told that this was what you did when things went wrong. You pressed your hands against the table and you worked it out. I can do that, she said. I know, he said, which was an interesting thing to say given that he didn't know her, not really, but he said it with a quietness that didn't sound like flattery. It sounded like a conclusion he'd already reached and was just stating. The ranch appeared around a long bend in the track, the house first, then the barn, then the smaller structures arranged with the practical, unbeautiful logic of a working property. Elias had said the house was in decent shape, and he had told the truth. It was weather-tight and standing, and the porch was intact, which was more than could be said for some of the fence line she'd seen on the way in. It was not beautiful. It was plain clapboard, gray from weather rather than paint, 2 stories with a pitched roof that had clearly been repaired at different times by different hands. But it was solid. Clara could see solid from a distance. What she saw first, before the house or the barn, were the girls. They were standing at the fence gate, both of them, waiting. The taller one, Lucy, it had to be Lucy, was standing absolutely straight with her arms at her sides and her face set in the careful expressionlessness of a child determined to appear older than she was. The smaller one, May, had given up on any pretense of composure and was hanging off the fence gate in a way that suggested she had been hanging off it for some time. When the wagon came close enough, May dropped off the gate entirely and ran 3 steps toward them before apparently remembering she'd been told to wait, and then stopped and stood there vibrating with suppressed momentum. Lucy did not run. Lucy watched. Elias pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. "Girls." "She's here," May announced in the tone of someone confirming a rumor they had personally been responsible for spreading. "She is," Elias agreed. He came around and held Bess's head while Clara dismounted. "This is Miss Whitmore. Clara." May looked up at Clara with the open, systematic interest of a 6-year-old performing an assessment that she had apparently not been told was impolite. Her gaze moved from Clara's boots to her coat to her face and paused, briefly, just a fraction of a second, on the left side and then moved on, and her expression didn't change, and she said, "You brought something in that cloth." "Cornbread," Clara said, "from Mrs. Alcott's boarding house in town." "Is it good cornbread?" "I think so, though you'll have to tell me." May appeared to find this a reasonable answer. She looked at Clara's suitcase being lifted from the wagon. "Is that everything you own?" "May," Elias said. "It's a fair question," Clara said. "Yes, that's most of it." "We have more room than that," May said helpfully. "You can get more things." "May." Elias's voice was mild but clear, the voice of a man who'd been navigating this particular child's conversational approach for 6 years and had reached a certain pragmatic acceptance. Clara looked at Lucy. Lucy had not moved from her position by the fence. She was watching Clara with dark, serious eyes that were so much like her father's, it was slightly startling. The same quality of looking at something and thinking carefully about what you were seeing. "Hello, Lucy," Clara said. "Hello," Lucy said. After a pause, "Do you know how to make pie?" "I do." "What kind?" "Apple mostly, dried apple this time of year, peach when there's peach. I can do a serviceable vinegar pie if there's nothing else available." Lucy appeared to file this information. "Papa makes beans," she said. "I heard." "They're fine beans," Lucy said, in a tone that communicated clearly that the beans were not fine. "I can make other things." "Can you make chicken?" May interrupted. "We have chickens. We could eat one." "We are not eating the chickens," Elias said. "The chickens are for eggs." "We could eat one of the ones that doesn't lay anymore," May said. "Clementine doesn't lay anymore. Papa, Clementine doesn't lay." "I know Clementine doesn't lay. We've discussed Clementine." "We could discuss her again." "No," Elias said, with the weariness of a man who had been on the losing side of the Clementine discussion multiple times and knew he would continue to be. He picked up Clara's suitcase. "Come inside. I'll show you where things are." The inside of the house was exactly what she'd expected from a man who had described it as functional, clean enough, but stripped down to necessities. The way places look when whoever used to arrange the small things, the curtains, the few books on a shelf, the rag rug by the hearth, is no longer there to maintain them, and the person who remains has kept everything working without quite understanding what was working in the first place. The kitchen was the strongest room. Elias had kept up with the kitchen in the practical sense. The stove was in good order. The woodpile beside the back door was solid. The shelves held their flour and salt and dried goods in a reasonable arrangement. But the curtains on the kitchen window were faded nearly to nothing, and there was a crack in the plaster above the door frame that no one had gotten around to fixing, and the table was a good heavy table that had been scrubbed so many times the wood was soft at the edges. Clara put her hand on the table. It was a table that had been worked at. She could feel it. Elias stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands again. She was beginning to understand that the hat in the hands was a specific gesture, not general nervousness, but the particular discomfort of a man who was used to knowing what he was doing and found himself in a situation where he didn't. "I know it needs work," he said. "It needs some things," Claire said. "Not everything." She looked around the kitchen with the eye she had learned to use, the one that saw not what was wrong, but what could be made useful. "The stove is good. Had it 8 years. And the pantry stocks? Low from the summer. I've been meaning to get to town for flour and a few other things, but..." He stopped. "But there's always something else." She understood that. She'd lived that. "I'll make a list. Do you have an account at the dry goods?" "With Harlan Marsh, yes." "All right." She turned around and looked at him. "I'll need to understand the money situation before I start spending any, even with an account." Something moved in his face. She couldn't tell if it was relief or something more complicated. Most people she'd found expected women to look away from the money conversation. She had never understood why. "I'll show you the books after supper," he said. "Good." May appeared in the doorway beside her father, small and intent. "Are you going to fix the curtains?" "What's wrong with the curtains?" Clara said. "They're sad." "May," Elias said. "They are, Papa. They look sad." Clara looked at the curtains. They did, in fact, look sad. The color entirely gone, the hems fraying, the kind of sad that comes not from damage, but from just outlasting whatever life they were part of. "Yes," she said to May. "I'll fix the curtains." May looked satisfied. Lucy, who had appeared behind her sister, said nothing, but Clara caught the slight change in her posture. Not relaxation exactly, but the small, careful adjustment of a child who has noted something and is deciding what to do with it. Clara found her footing in the kitchen that first evening in the way she found her footing in any new kitchen, methodically, starting with what was there and working out from it. She had beans. Elias had beans. Always beans. The stalwart beans that had apparently been the family's primary nutritional companion for the past year. But she also found salt pork and onions and a string of dried peppers hanging by the back door, and a small jar of molasses on the top shelf that someone had put there and forgotten. And she made something with all of those things that was, in the end, substantially better than beans. May announced this at the table with the specific joy of a child who has had a culinary revelation. "It's still beans," Lucy said. "It's not just beans," May said. "It's different. Papa, it's different." "It's different," Elias confirmed. Lucy ate the rest of her serving without further comment, which Clara had already begun to understand was as close to approval as Lucy was prepared to offer on a first evening. After supper, when the girls had gone up to bed, May with minimal protest, Lucy with the resigned dignity of a child who knows the battle has been lost, but wants it on record that she was perfectly capable of staying up, Elias came to the kitchen table with a ledger and laid it open. The finances of the Ward Ranch were not good. They were not catastrophic. Elias had managed to keep the land and the stock and the building, which was more than a lot of men in his position could say. But they were thin in the way that meant one bad season could tip from thin into gone. Clara read the numbers with the attention she had given to her mother's household accounts 20 years ago. The same quality of focus, the same habit of looking for where the leakage was. "The fence repairs are the biggest drain," she said. "The south fence has been a problem for 2 years. The posts are rotted at the base. You need to replace it properly, rather than keep fixing it. I know, I don't have the capital right now. What about the north pasture? You're not running stock there. Too far from water. Could you trench a line from the creek?" Elias looked at her. Yes, in theory. It would take time. But if you did it, you'd have another 100 acres of usable pasture. That's worth the fence repair on the south side twice over, if you can run cattle on it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. "I've been thinking too close to the problem," he said. "You've been managing a ranch and raising 2 girls by yourself for 14 months, Clara said. "You're allowed to be tired." Something shifted in his face when she said that. Not dramatically. He was not a man who showed things dramatically, but the particular tightness around his eyes eased slightly, and he looked for just a moment like a person who had been given permission to put down something heavy. The cattle I'm running now, he said, if I get them to market at weight, should cover the fence repair and leave something over. But the market's uncertain right now. Prices dropped in July. Then you need a contingency. What else can the ranch produce? Some. I've thought about chickens. Not the chickens again, Clara said. Elias blinked. Then he almost smiled. That same brief, involuntary thing she'd seen on the boarding house porch. May's been working on you. May made a compelling case for Clementine. May would. They sat with the ledger between them for another hour, going through it line by line. It was not a comfortable conversation. There is nothing comfortable about sitting with a stranger and reading the exact shape of their financial difficulty. But it was a real conversation, and Clara had been having those for long enough to know they mattered more than comfortable ones. When Elias finally closed the ledger, he sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. It was an unselfconscious gesture, the kind that comes out when a person stops managing their impression of themselves and just responds to the actual moment. I appreciate this, he said. I haven't talked about any of it with anyone, not in a real way. Who would you have talked to? He thought about it. No one, I suppose. The ranch hands aren't here anymore. I had to let them go in the spring. The neighbors are far enough that it's not a casual conversation, and I didn't want to. I didn't want the girls to know how close things were. They probably already know, Clara said. Children usually do. Lucy does, he said quietly. I know she does. She started eating less at meals, and I thought she was just being difficult, and then I realized she was trying to make the food last longer. He stopped. She's 9 years old. Clara looked at the table's surface. She thought about Lucy at the fence, standing so straight, with her arms at her sides. She won't need to do that anymore, she said. I'm going to try to make sure of it. Don't try, Clara said. Just don't let her. She needs to be 9, not 40. Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and stood up and took the ledger back to wherever he kept it. The first weeks established a shape. Clara learned the ranch the way she learned everything, by doing it and making mistakes and correcting the mistakes without excessive self-criticism. She burned the first batch of bread in the new stove, which had a different character than Mrs. Alcott's and needed to be understood on its own terms. She misjudged the distance to the chicken coop in the dark the first morning and walked into the fence post hard enough to leave a bruise on her hip that stayed colorful for a week. She got lost trying to find the north pasture on the second Saturday and spent 40 minutes walking in the wrong direction before the logic of the land's slope corrected her. None of this was comfortable. All of it was, in its way, useful. May was easy. May was easy the way some children are easy, with a natural warmth that doesn't require maintenance, that flows toward people like water toward low ground. By the third day, May had taken to following Clara through the morning chores, not helping precisely, but providing a running commentary on everything she was observing that Clara found, against her expectations, genuinely entertaining. That's the crack, May said one morning, pointing at the plaster above the kitchen door frame. I know, Clara said. I'm going to fix it this week. Papa looked at it for a long time once, May said, and then he went outside. That's a common response to a crack in the plaster. What are you going to use to fix it? Plaster, and a trowel, if there's one in the barn. There's a trowel, May said. I know where it is. I can get it. After breakfast. Can I help fix the crack? You can watch me fix the crack and tell me if I'm doing it wrong. May appeared to find this an excellent use of her time. Lucy took longer. Lucy observed from the distance of a child who has been hurt in a specific way and has decided that caution is the appropriate response to new things. She was not rude. She was too careful for rudeness, too aware of what it would cost her. But she maintained a consistent half-step of removal, a watching rather than a participating, that Clara respected because she understood it. She did not push Lucy. She did not try to win her. She simply did what she was there to do, and let Lucy watch, and waited. The thing that shifted it was small. It was a Thursday, about 2 weeks in, and Clara was at the table working on the accounts. She had started keeping them fresh, updating Elias's ledger daily rather than weekly, which made the numbers less frightening because you could see the shape of them more clearly. When Lucy came in from school and sat at the other end of the table and took out her own schoolwork, and they sat in the same room without speaking for 40 minutes, and when Lucy got stuck on an arithmetic problem and said, mostly to the table, "I don't understand how this works," Clara got up and came around and sat beside her and worked through it with her. And that was the thing. Not the working through the arithmetic. The fact that Clara had come around the table to do it. The fact that she had put herself beside rather than across from. Lucy didn't say anything about it, but the half step of removal got smaller after that. The first time Clara encountered Gideon Blackwell after leaving Abilene, she was at Harlan Marsh's dry goods store in town, picking up the supplies she had listed and not spent a single unnecessary dollar on. It was a Thursday in mid-October, 3.5 weeks after she had arrived at the Ward Ranch, and she had gotten a handle on the weekly supplies enough to come alone while Elias stayed with the girls. She was at the counter when the door opened and Blackwell came in with another man she didn't know. He saw her immediately. The store was small, and there was nowhere to not see someone. And the series of reactions on his face happened quickly enough that she caught all of them. Surprise, recognition, and then the hardening that she remembered from the train platform. The decision to manage the moment in a way that cost him nothing. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Clara turned back to Harlan Marsh. "And a pound of the salt pork, please." Harlan Marsh, to his credit, wrote it down without looking up. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwell said again, and she could hear him moving toward the counter. "I didn't expect to find you still in Abilene." "I'm not in Abilene," Clara said. "I'm on the Ward Ranch." A pause. "Ward's place?" "Yes." Another pause, this one longer. "You're working for Elias Ward." "I am." "Well," he said it like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't written. "I suppose that's one way to make do." Clara looked at Harlan Marsh. "I think that's everything. Can you add it to the Ward account?" "Happy to, Miss Whitmore." "Thank you." She picked up the wrapped package. She turned around to leave, and Blackwell was standing 3 feet behind her, which was closer than she'd expected, and the man with him was watching with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who had been brought along to buy flour and found himself in a scene. Blackwell looked at her face for a moment, at the birthmark specifically, the way he had at the train station, like he was confirming something he needed to confirm. And then he said, "I want you to know I bear you no ill will about how that business ended." "I know," Clara said. "You made that clear when you threw money at me in front of 40 people. I offered you compensation. You threw a coin at my feet," Clara said. "You know the difference. I know you know the difference." His jaw tightened. "I think you've made a choice that's going to be a hard one," he said. "Ward's struggling. Anyone in this county can tell you that." "Anyone in this county can tell me a lot of things," Clara said. "Most of them aren't my business." She shifted the package under her arm. "Good day, Mr. Blackwell." She walked out of Harlan Marsh's dry goods store into the October air, which was sharp and smelled of coming cold, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk and took a breath and felt something clarify inside her. Not anger, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific feeling of a person who has just said a thing they meant and found that the saying of it confirmed something they already knew about themselves. She had not needed him. She had not needed him 3 weeks ago on that platform, and she did not need him now. And the knowing of that was its own kind of solid ground. She untied Bess from the hitching post and headed back toward the ranch. And the miles went by under the gray October sky, and she thought about Lucy at the table with her arithmetic, and May telling her the curtains were sad, and Elias's hands on the ledger in the lamplight, and the particular quality of a place that was not yet home but was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of work still ahead, to have the shape of one. The cold came early that year. By the first week of November, the mornings had a bite to them that Clara hadn't quite prepared for. Not the cold itself. She had grown up with Philadelphia winters and understood cold in the abstract, but the specific quality of Kansas cold, the way it came in flat and unobstructed across the open land with nothing to slow it down and nowhere to go except through whatever was standing in its way. She learned to start the kitchen stove 20 minutes earlier, to bank the coals at night with more care, to check the water barrel each morning before she assumed it was still liquid. These were small adjustments. She made them without drama. What changed that November was larger than the cold, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. The first sign was a neighbor. His name was Dale Pritchard, and he ran a modest operation 3 miles to the east. A man in his 50s with a deliberate way of speaking that Clara had learned to associate with people who had been burned by saying things carelessly. He rode over on a Wednesday morning when Elias was out working the south fence, still working the south fence, still fighting the same rotted posts, and found Clara in the yard splitting wood. He stopped his horse and looked at her for a moment. "You're Ward's woman," he said. It was not a question, and it was not precisely rude, but it had the quality of a statement that expected to be confirmed or denied. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "I manage the household here." He dismounted and tied his horse to the post. "Elias around?" "South pasture. Is there something I can help with?" Pritchard looked at her with the assessing expression of a man deciding how much to say to someone he didn't know yet. "There's talk in town," he said finally, "about Blackwell. There's usually talk in town about someone. This is particular talk." He took off his hat. "Blackwell's been buying up parcels. 3 in the last 2 months. Small operations mostly. Men who got into trouble after a bad summer and needed to sell. He's moving quiet, but he's moving." Clara set down the splitting axe. "What does that have to do with Elias?" "Ward's got the best water rights in this section of the county. Creek runs through his north property, and under an 1871 agreement with the county, whoever holds that land controls the upstream flow for the next 6 properties downstream, including mine." Pritchard turned his hat in his hands. "If Blackwell gets Ward's land, he controls the water for half the ranches on this side of the valley." Clara stood very still. "Has he approached Elias?" she said. "Don't know. That's why I'm here." He looked at her steadily. "Ward's a stubborn man. Even if he knew, he might not tell anyone. He's not the kind to ask for help." "No," Clara said, "he's not. But if Blackwell's working up to making an offer, or working up to something worse, there are ways men like that make things difficult for a property owner when they want the property badly enough. Debt pressure, legal challenges to the deed, interfering with market access." He put his hat back on. "I wanted someone at this ranch to know the shape of it, whatever good that does." After he left, Clara stood in the yard for a long time with the splitting axe at her feet and thought about the ledger she had been keeping for the past 6 weeks. She thought about the numbers she had memorized, not because she had tried to memorize them, but because she thought carefully about things that mattered, and the numbers had mattered. She thought about Elias's water rights and the north pasture they hadn't developed yet, and the fence on the south that kept needing repair and the cattle he was counting on getting to market weight by spring. She thought about Gideon Blackwell standing in Harlan Marsh's dry goods store telling her Ward's struggling. "Anyone in this county can tell you that, with the particular quality of a man who says things because he wants you to know he knows them." She picked up the axe and split 3 more logs with more force than was strictly necessary, and then she went inside to start dinner and think. No, she didn't tell Elias immediately. This was a decision she made deliberately, not from any desire to manage him, but because she needed to understand what she was dealing with before she brought it to him. Elias Ward was not a man who received bad news passively. She had come to know this about him in the 6 weeks she'd been here, the way he absorbed information and immediately began calculating responses, sometimes before he had all the information he needed. She wanted to bring him something more than Pritchard's warning. She wanted to bring him the shape of the problem clearly enough that they could look at it together without the looking turning into panic. So she spent 2 days. She went back over the ledger. She thought carefully about everything Pritchard had told her about the water rights and the downstream properties. She rode to the north pasture. Elias had shown her the property boundaries in September, a long afternoon walking the fence lines while May rode on Bess's back and narrated what she saw from up there. And she stood at the creek and looked at the water moving south and thought about what it meant to the 6 properties below. On the 3rd day, she asked Miss Hallie a question. The school teacher had become a periodic visitor. She boarded in town but rode out to the ranch on some Saturday afternoons, having formed an attachment to May that was mutual and enthusiastic and involved a great deal of educational activity that May did not realize was educational. Clara liked her. She liked her steady practicality and her complete absence of interest in performing innocence about the difficulties of the world. "I need to know if there's a way to look at the county deed records," Clara said. They were sitting at the kitchen table. The girls were outside. Elias was in the barn. Miss Hallie looked at her over her cup. The county recorder's office has them. They're public record. Anyone can go in and look. Even a woman. Technically, yes, though the clerk, Bert Sykes, is the kind of man who might find reasons to be inconvenient about it. He does better if you give him a clear official reason for being there. And if I said I was checking property boundaries for the Ward Ranch, that would be a clear official reason. Miss Hallie set down her cup. What are you looking for? I want to see which parcels Blackwell has acquired in the past 6 months. I want to see if there's a pattern to them relative to the water rights in this section. A brief silence. That's a specific thing to be looking for. It is. Miss Hallie looked at her for a moment, the careful, assessing look of a woman deciding whether to say a thing or leave it alone. Do you want company when you go to the recorder's office? I think it would help. Saturday, Miss Hallie said. I'll be there. Elias found out before Saturday. Not because Clara told him, but because Gideon Blackwell came to the ranch. It was Friday afternoon, the sky going orange and cold in the west, and Clara was in the yard bringing in the last of the week's laundry when she heard the sound of a horse on the track and looked up and saw him coming. He was alone, which she hadn't expected, and he rode with the ease of a man who felt comfortable arriving places unannounced, which she had expected entirely. She stood where she was and waited. Blackwell pulled up at the yard gate and looked at her with the particular expression she had come to categorize in her mind as his assessing face, the one that tallied things, the one that had tallied her at the train station and found her worth less than a gold coin. Miss Whitmore, he said, I heard you were still here. I am. Where's Ward? He'll be in shortly. She didn't move toward the gate. You're welcome to wait, if you need to speak to him. I do. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post outside the gate and came through, and she noticed he hadn't asked permission to come through, which told her something about how he understood his relationship to other people's property. He looked around the yard with the measuring quality of a man estimating value, and she watched him do it with the kind of cold attention she brought to things she needed to understand fully. The place looks better than the last time I was out this way, he said. He glanced at the house, the fresh plaster on the porch column where it had cracked, the new curtains visible through the kitchen window, the stack of split wood ranked properly against the barn wall. Ward been putting in more work? He works hard, Claire said. He always has. Blackwell looked at her. I think you know why I'm here. I have ideas. Then let me be plain. He turned to face her fully. Ward's in a difficult position. The cattle market was poor this fall, and spring isn't going to be better. I have contacts in Wichita who know the numbers. He's carrying debt on that south fence, and if he doesn't get those cattle to wait and to market at a decent price, he's going to find himself in a very tight place by summer. He paused. I'm in a position to make him a fair offer on the property. He'd walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere more forgiving. Clara looked at him. And what would you do with it? Run cattle, same as he does. He said it smoothly, too smoothly, the smoothness of a man who had rehearsed this conversation. With the water rights, Clara said. Something shifted in his face, a slight recalibration. Water rights come with the land. They do. And anyone who controls the upstream creek in this section of the county controls the water supply for 6 downstream properties. She kept her voice level. I know that, Mr. Blackwell. Dale Pritchard knows that. I imagine most of your neighbors here know it too, even if they haven't said so out loud yet. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the smoothness was still there, but it had a harder edge underneath it. You're a housekeeper, he said. You manage his kitchen and his girls. I'm not sure this is your conversation to have. I manage his accounts, Claire said. I know every number in his ledger. I know his water rights and his property boundaries and his outstanding obligations better than anyone except him. This is exactly my conversation to have. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger, not the cold management of the train station, but a more complicated thing, a reassessment happening in real time. He hadn't expected her. He had expected to arrive at the Ward Ranch and find a housekeeper and wait for the rancher, and instead he had found this. You're a smart woman, he said, and his voice had changed, dropped the salesman quality, gone slightly flatter. I'll give you that. But smart women in this part of the country know when they're overextended. Is that a threat? It's an observation. It sounds like a threat. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Tell Ward I came. Tell him I'd like to talk. I'll tell him you came, Clara said. What you'd like is your own business. He held her gaze for a moment. A long, deliberate moment. The kind that was meant to make a person feel the weight of being looked at by someone who considered himself consequential. Then he turned and went back through the gate and mounted and rode away. And Clara stood in the yard with the laundry in her arms and watched him go. She was still standing there when Elias came in from the barn. He read her face. She had learned he could do this, quickly and accurately, the way people learn to read weather, and said, "What happened?" It wasn't a question either. She told him. All of it, starting with Pritchard's visit, the time she had spent with the ledger and the creek and the land, the trip she had planned with Miss Hallie to the recorder's office, and then Blackwell's arrival just now and every word that had been said. She told it straight and without editorializing, because he needed the information clean. Elias listened with his arms folded and his face doing the things she had seen it do when he was working through a serious problem. Very still, very focused, the kind of focus that didn't leave room for reaction until the thinking was done. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You went to Pritchard," he said. "Pritchard came here. I went to the land to look at the creek. And the recorder's office. Saturday, not yet." He unfolded his arms and rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the yard where Blackwell's horse had stood. "He's been circling," he said. "I knew it. I didn't know the water rights angle, but I knew he was circling. Men like that have a way of making themselves present. The water rights are what makes this property worth his trouble," Clara said. "Without them, it's just a struggling ranch in a difficult market. With them, it's leverage over half a dozen neighbors. That's what he wants. He won't get it. Not if we can establish publicly that you understand what you have and what it's worth." She looked at him. "If we can get into the recorder's office and get a clear record of his acquisition pattern and bring it to Pritchard and the other downstream owners, and they understand what's at stake, Blackwell loses his advantage. He needs this to be a quiet transaction. If the whole valley knows what he's trying to do, he can't do it quietly." Elias was looking at her with the expression she had seen before. That particular quality of looking at something and finding it different from what he'd expected to find. "You've been working this out for 3 days," he said. 2.5. "Why didn't you tell me when Pritchard came?" "Because I wanted to understand it before I brought it to you." "Ah, that's my ranch," he said. Not angry. She could hear the difference. Something more complicated. "My land. My problem." "I know," she said. "And I know you can handle your own problems. That's not why I did it. I did it because—" She stopped. "Because it matters to me too," she thought. "Because I have been here 6 weeks, and I have learned the shape of this place and the shape of these people, and it matters to me what happens to them. And I am not going to stand to the side of something I can help with because it's not technically my land. Because I'm here," she said. "That's what being here means." The yard was quiet. From inside the house, she could hear May's voice, high and particular, narrating something to Lucy, who was making the low sound she made when May was narrating more than she needed to. "Saturday," Elias said. "Saturday. I'm coming with you." "Good," Clara said. "Bert Sykes apparently does better with clear official reasons. A rancher checking his own deed records is about as clear as it gets." Quote. The recorder's office was a small, overheated room at the back of the county building, presided over by Bert Sykes, who was exactly what Miss Hallie had predicted. A neat, self-important man of about 50, who looked at Clara's birthmark with the reflexive discomfort she had cataloged so many times it barely registered anymore, and who brightened noticeably when Elias stated the purpose of their visit in plain landowner terms. "Property boundary, verification, and deed review," Elias said. "Ward Ranch, Section 14. "Of course. Of course." Sykes pulled the relevant ledgers with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew his filing system and was proud of it. "Going back how far?" 1871, Clara said, "when the water rights agreement was established." Sykes looked at her briefly.
Then he looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him with the particular patience of a man who was waiting for a specific thing to happen and intended to wait as long as necessary. Sykes brought the ledgers. Miss Hallie had come too, and while Sykes fluttered around the front of the office, she sat beside Clara at the table and they went through the records with careful, unhurried attention. On under, after the summer's poor market. Clara had heard of both of them, from conversations in Harlan Marsh's store and from Elias's scattered mentions of neighbors in difficulty. The third was a section of land that appeared to have no immediate agricultural value, but sat directly adjacent to the downstream edge of the county's water agreement. The fourth was the most interesting, a half-section purchase that included a small stake in a limestone quarry and buried in the deed language, a water access easement to the county creek. Clara read that fourth deed 3 times. "He's not just trying to control the upstream property," she said quietly to Miss Hallie. "He's already established a downstream easement. If he gets Elias's land, he owns both ends of the water access for this whole section." Miss Hallie looked at the document. "Can he do that? Own both ends?" "Legally, right now, probably yes. Unless the downstream property owners formally object to the easement." She looked at Elias, who was standing behind them, reading over their shoulders. "Did you know about this easement?" "No," he said, and his voice had gone very even in the way voices went when a person was making a deliberate effort to stay controlled. "I didn't know he'd filed that." "It was filed in August," Clara said. "When was the last time you looked at the county records?" A pause. "I haven't. Not since I bought the place." "Most people haven't," Clara said. She was not reproaching him. It was simply true that most people didn't monitor the county deed records, and Blackwell clearly counted on that. "He's been very methodical." "He can be methodical all he wants," Elias said. "If we can get Pritchard and the other downstream owners to file a formal objection to that easement before he can consolidate it." "Can they do that?" Miss Hallie asked. "I don't know," Clara said, "but I know someone who would." She was thinking about Ruth Garrett, who had sent her to Mrs. Alcott's boarding house on her first day in Abilene. Ruth Garrett, who had said, "I've been the subject of enough stories in my time to know the difference with a precision that suggested she knew a great deal more about how things worked in this county than her dry goods store implied." Ruth Garrett listened to the whole of it over the counter of her store on the following Tuesday, with the focused attention of someone doing arithmetic in her head while other people talked. Her expression didn't change much. When Clara finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My husband filed a competing water easement in 1869 and lost it in court because he didn't know the right language to put in the objection. The lawyer who helped Blackwell's side is dead now, but his partner is still practicing in Wichita." "We can't afford a Wichita lawyer," Clara said. "You don't need one. What you need is for 5 or 6 downstream property owners to file a joint complaint with the county recorder within 30 days of the easement's establishment, which you're still inside if Sykes's records say August, stating that the easement materially affects their property rights under the 1871 agreement and requesting a county review." She looked at Clara steadily. "I know this because I should have known it 20 years ago and I didn't, and I went looking for it afterward when it was too late to help me. I've had the information sitting in my head ever since, waiting for a reason to use it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Will you help us get the downstream owners together?" "I know all of them," Ruth said. 3 of them owe me money, which is useful. Give me until Friday." What Ruth Garrett assembled on Friday afternoon in the back room of her store was not a formal gathering. There were no chairs arranged in rows, no agenda, no particular sense of occasion. It was simply 5 men and 1 woman, and Ruth herself, crowded into a room with a wood stove that was working too hard, and a table with a map spread on it, and Clara standing at the head of the table with the copy of the county deed record she had paid Bert Sykes to produce, and the patience of a woman who had been explaining things to people who initially didn't want to hear them for most of her adult life. She had been nervous before walking in. She would have admitted that to someone who asked, and no one asked, which was fine. She had stood outside Ruth Garrett's store for approximately 45 seconds and told herself that she knew what she knew, and that knowing things was the same whether you were saying them in a kitchen or in a room full of ranchers, and then she had gone in. She laid out the deed acquisitions one by one. She showed them Blackwell's pattern, The properties he'd bought, the positions they occupied relative to the water agreement, the easement he had quietly filed in August. She showed them what it meant if he acquired the Ward Ranch, a single man controlling water access for all 6 of their operations. One of the men, a broad, skeptical rancher named Connolly, who had been making small sounds of impatience throughout, said, "Even if all of this is what you say it is, what do we do about it? Blackwell has money and lawyers." "You file a joint complaint," Clara said. "Under the terms of the 1871 agreement, any property holder affected by a change in water access has 30 days to contest it through the county recorder. You're inside that window. If all 6 of you sign a joint objection to the August easement, it triggers a mandatory county review. That review becomes a public record. Blackwell can't make his offer to Elias look like a simple business transaction anymore. It becomes a matter of county record that it's a strategic acquisition with implications for the whole valley. And if the county reviewer sides with Blackwell anyway, then you're in a harder position," Clara said. "But you're in a worse position if you do nothing." Another silence. Connolly was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just been told something he didn't want to agree with and was running out of reasons not to. "Who's going to write this objection?" "I will," Clara said. "You're not a lawyer." "I know, but I've read enough legal documents in the past 2 weeks to understand the language, and Ruth Garrett knows the specific clauses that need to be cited, and Miss Hallie has a clean hand and will copy the final version." She looked around the table. "We don't need a perfect document. We need a filed document. Those are different things." It took another hour. There were objections raised and answered, skepticisms voiced and addressed, 2 men who needed to be convinced separately by the men they trusted before they would sign anything. Clara stood through it and answered questions and corrected misunderstandings and waited out the silences that were really just people making up their minds. In the end, all 6 signed. Elias hadn't said much during the meeting. He had sat at the edge of the group with his arms folded and his face doing its focusing thing, speaking only when someone addressed him directly, which was fine. This was not a moment that needed him to perform authority. When they filed out and it was just him and Clara and Ruth Garrett left in the room, he looked at Clara for a long moment and said, "You wrote a legal document. I wrote a document that uses legal language. Ruth helped. You organized 6 stubborn ranchers. Ruth knew them all. Clara." His voice was quiet. "You did this." She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, not gratitude exactly, which would have been easier to receive, but something more direct than gratitude, a kind of recognition, the particular quality of being seen by someone who had been watching carefully enough to actually see. "We need to file it Monday," she said, "before the 30-day window closes." "Monday," he said. "I know." He picked up his hat from the table and turned it over in his hands once, and she thought about the first time she had seen him do that, on the boarding house porch in the dark, and how she had read that gesture as the discomfort of a man who didn't know what he was doing, and how she understood now that she had been wrong about that. It wasn't the discomfort of a man without a plan. It was the discomfort of a man who was being careful about what he said and what he asked for and what he expected, because he had learned the hard way that careless expectations cost people more than they had to spare. She understood that better than she had 6 weeks ago. She understood it, in fact, quite well. Ruth Garrett, who had been quietly putting the map away, looked up and looked at the 2 of them and said nothing, which was a quality Clara appreciated in her enormously. "Monday," Clara said again, and picked up her copy of the deed records, and they went out into the November cold together. They filed the complaint on Monday morning. Bert Sykes received it with the expression of a man who had been handed something he recognized as significant and wasn't sure how he felt about that. He read through the document twice, slowly, while Elias and Clara stood at the counter and waited. The office was cold. The wood stove hadn't caught properly yet, and Clara could hear the wind working at the window frame in the particular persistent way of November wind, not violent but relentless, the kind that found every gap. 6 signatures, Sykes said. 6 downstream property holders, Clara confirmed, all within the affected radius of the 1871 water agreement,
The complaint cites Section 4 of that agreement, which you'll find in the August 1871 ledger, third shelf, if you need to verify. Sykes looked at her over the document. Then he looked at Elias. Then he looked back at the document. "I'll need to log this and notify the county commissioner's office," he said. "A review like this takes time." "How much time?" Elias said. 30 to 60 days, typically. The commissioner will appoint a reviewer. Both parties, the complainants and the easement holder, will be notified and given opportunity to present their positions. "So Blackwell will know about this," Clara said. "He'll be notified, yes. That's the process." She had expected that. She had told herself she had expected that. All the way through the preparation and the organizing and the writing of the document, and she still felt something tighten in her chest when Sykes said it out loud. Blackwell would know, and Blackwell would respond, and whatever his response was, it would not be nothing. They walked out of the county building into the gray Monday morning and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment. Elias put his hat on. Clara pulled her coat collar up against the wind. "It's done," he said. "It started," she said. "Done is different." He looked at her sideways. "You're not a comforting woman." "No," she agreed. "I'm not complaining." He started walking toward the wagon. "I've had enough comfort that turned out to be wrong information. I'd rather have accurate." Blackwell's response came faster than she'd expected. It was Thursday of that same week, 4 days after the filing, when a man came to the ranch that Clara didn't recognize. He arrived mid-morning when Elias was in the north pasture and the girls were at school, and he was not a rancher and not a neighbor. He wore a coat that was too good for the weather and too new for the territory, and he had the careful, unhurried manner of a man who was paid to be patient. "I'm looking for Elias Ward," he said. "He's not here," Clara said. She was at the porch, and she stayed on the porch, because inviting this man closer was not something she intended to do until she knew what he was. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I manage the household. Can I help you?" "I represent a business interest with a proposal for Mr. Ward regarding his property. I'd like to leave this for him." He produced an envelope from his coat and held it out. Clara came down the porch steps and took the envelope. She did not open it. Who should he contact to respond? "There's a name and address inside." He looked at her pleasantly, with the kind of pleasantness that was purely professional, a tool, not a quality. "I'd encourage Mr. Ward to read it carefully. The offer has a time limit." "Most things do," Clara said. He nodded, tipped his hat with the precision of a man performing courtesy rather than feeling it, and rode away. Clara stood in the yard and held the envelope and resisted the urge to open it, because it wasn't addressed to her, and she had already taken considerable liberties with Elias's problems, and she was not going to add reading his private correspondence to the list without his knowledge. She put it on the kitchen table and went back to the mending she had been doing and thought about time limits. Elias came in at noon. He saw the envelope immediately. She had left it in the center of the table where it couldn't be missed, and picked it up and looked at her. "A man brought it," she said. "Professional type. Said the offer has a time limit." Elias opened it. She watched his face while he read, which was not a process that showed much on the surface, but she had learned to read the small signs, the slight tightening around the jaw that meant something was wrong, the quality of stillness that meant he was working hard to stay still. He set the letter on the table and pushed it toward her. She read it. The offer was for the ranch, the land, the water rights, and all associated easements and agreements, at a price that was, she had to admit, reading it twice to make sure she had the number right, substantially above what the property would reasonably bring at a distressed sale. It was not a lowball offer. It was a serious offer, the kind designed to make a man think twice, and the time limit was 15 days. "That's more than I expected," she said. "It's more than the ranch is worth in a normal year." "It's not more than the water rights are worth," she said. "Not if he can control the whole valley's supply." Elias picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. Clara had seen him do this before. The specific posture of a man working through something in the presence of a person he trusted enough to do it in front of. "This ranch was my wife's too," he said. "She came here from Ohio when we were both younger than we had any business making permanent decisions. She planted those cottonwoods by the creek. She chose where the barn went. He stopped. I know that's not a financial argument. No, Clara said, but it's the true one. I'm not selling it. I know. But I need you to understand what we're walking toward if we don't. Blackwell doesn't like losing. He's going to find another way to pressure the situation. Probably, Clara said, but his options are narrower now that 6 people know what he's doing. He needed this to be quiet. It isn't quiet anymore. Elias looked at her. What would you do? She thought about it honestly, because he had asked honestly. I'd write back and decline. Formally in writing, clearly, so that the refusal is on record. And I'd send a copy of the refusal to Pritchard and the others so they know it's been refused and that you're holding. And then? And then we get those cattle to market weight and to Wichita before spring, and we dig the water line to the north pasture this winter while the ground isn't frozen solid yet, and we make the ranch worth more by spring than it is right now. She met his eyes. He's betting on your position getting worse. We need to make sure it gets better. A long quiet. The wind was at the window again. The stove ticked. We, Elias said. Clara looked at him. There it was. The word she'd said without thinking, without measuring, the way she had started saying things in this house, without the careful calibration she'd spent years applying to every word she put into the world. We. She had said it and meant it, and she wasn't going to take it back. If that's all right, she said. Elias Ward looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else either, and then he picked up his hat and said, I'll get the paper. You write better than I do. The county review was scheduled for the second week of December. In the weeks between the filing and the hearing, the Ward Ranch operated with the particular intensity of a place that knows it is being watched and has decided the best response to being watched is to be worth watching. Clara drove the practical side of it with the same methodical energy she brought to everything. She finished the North Pasture waterline assessment with Elias. They walked the grade together on a cold Saturday, May bundled and following at a distance, Lucy sensibly staying home, and worked out that trenching a gravity-fed line from the creek was not only possible, but could be done over the winter with 2 men and the right equipment. She wrote to 3 ranching supply companies in Wichita for equipment prices, and got 2 responses back within the week. She reorganized the pantry and the supply accounting to eliminate waste she had found in the first weeks. Not Elias's fault, just the accumulated inefficiency of a man managing too many things alone, and put the savings against the fence repair account. She tracked the cattle weights weekly and adjusted the feeding to push the herd toward market weight by February rather than March, which was tight but possible. She also, on a Wednesday evening when the girls were in bed and Elias was working on harness repair at the kitchen table and the lamplight was making the room look warmer than it was, sat across from him and said, Tell me what you need help with that you haven't told me about. He looked up from the harness. What? There's something you're managing that isn't in the ledger. I can tell by the way you look at the northwest fence line every time you ride past it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the posts are rotted. All of them, not just the south fence. I told you about the south fence because it was actively failing, but the northwest line is 2 bad winters from the same problem. I can't replace both sets of posts in the same year, not financially. I've been hoping the northwest holds. Has it shown cracks? One section. She looked at the table. Show me which section on the property map. He got up and went to the shelf where the property map was rolled and brought it back and unrolled it on the kitchen table between the lamp and the harness. He pointed to the northwest section. She looked at the map and thought about what she knew of the land's grade and the cattle's movement patterns. If that section fails, where do the cattle go? She said. Toward Connolly's property line. Connolly's one of the 6 signatories. Would he hold them until you could collect? Probably. Dale Connolly's a fair man once you get past the skepticism. Then patch the one failing section now and prioritize the south replacement in spring. If the northwest gives in a bad spot, Connolly's your fallback, and you'll have the spring market money to address the full northwest line before next winter. She looked at him. It's not a good solution. No. It's the available one. He was looking at the map still. You've been thinking about this property like it's your problem to solve, he said. It is my problem to solve, Clara said. I'm here. That's what being here means. I said that before. I know what you said. He looked up from the map. His face was doing something she couldn't immediately read. Not the thinking focus, not the management of a difficult emotion, something quieter than both of those. Clara, I need to ask you something. She waited. When spring comes, he said, what are you planning? She hadn't expected that. She had been expecting something about the fence or the water line or the hearing. She looked at him across the unrolled map with the lamp between them and thought about the question seriously because he had asked it seriously and he deserved a serious answer. I hadn't planned past the hearing, she said honestly. I know you came here for a specific arrangement that didn't work out, he said, and I know what I offered you in September was different. It was work. It was practical. It was... He stopped, turned the harness over in his hands once, put it down. I don't want you to stay because it's practical. Clara was very still. I want you to stay because... He stopped again, and she could see him working for the right words, not performing the search, but genuinely doing it, genuinely finding the words insufficient for what he was trying to say. Because my daughters have started sleeping better, he said. Because Lucy showed me an arithmetic problem she solved last week, and she said Clara showed me this. And she said it the way she used to say things about her mother. Because May has started talking about the curtains as our curtains. He met her eyes. And because I have not sat across from another person and talked honestly about the things that matter in 14 months, not until you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing its November work, and the cottonwoods were moving, and the cattle were quiet in the barn, and inside there was just the lamp and the map and the harness on the table, and Elias Ward looking at her with the expression she had never seen on his face before, the one that had no management in it at all. You're not asking me anything, she said carefully. I'm working up to it. He held her gaze. Would you marry me? It was not phrased the way men usually phrased it in her limited experience of men phrasing it, which had been entirely in letters and therefore probably artificial to begin with. It was not particularly romantic. It was direct and slightly clumsy, and she could see in his face that he knew both of those things, and was asking anyway, because asking carefully didn't seem to be getting him where he needed to go. She thought about all the reasons to be cautious. There were real ones. She had come to Kansas for one man, and it had cost her everything she'd brought with her. She had built her footing here slowly and carefully, and the footing was good now, and she was aware, with the awareness of a person who had lost good things before, of how quickly good things could be lost. She thought about Lucy's arithmetic problem, about May and the curtains, about Elias's hands on the ledger in the lamplight, and the way he had turned his hat on the boarding house porch, and the specific quality of a man who said, I don't write letters very well without any defensiveness about it. Yes, she said. He breathed out. Just once. A single, quiet breath, the kind that carries the weight of something that has been held in for longer than the conversation. All right, he said. All right, she said. Then, because neither of them was the kind of person who improved a moment by extending it past its natural length, she pulled the map back toward her and said, The northwest fence. If you patch the failing section before the ground freezes, it'll hold better. You've got maybe 2 weeks of workable ground left. Elias Ward looked at her across the lamp, and this time the corner of his mouth moved, fully and without restraint, and he said, 2 weeks. At most. Then I'd better get started in the morning. Bosam. The county hearing came on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every respect except that it wasn't. Clara had been in courtrooms before, once, years ago, a landlord dispute in Philadelphia that her mother had navigated alone and won on the basis of sheer preparedness. And she had understood then that these proceedings rewarded the same quality her mother always rewarded, knowing what you knew and saying it without apology. The county commissioner's hearing room was not a courtroom in the formal sense. It was a converted meeting room with a long table and chairs and a window that faced south and let in the December light at a low, slanted angle that caught the dust in the air and made it visible.
Commissioner Aldous Hayes was a man of 60 with the deliberate manner of someone who had watched too many contentious hearings to be surprised by them, but retained enough investment in fairness to take the proceedings seriously. Blackwell came with a lawyer. The lawyer was from Wichita, as Clara had expected, a lean man named Hargreave with the compressed precision of someone who billed by the hour and had learned to make every minute count. On the other side of the table, Elias, Clara, Pritchard, Connolly, and two of the other signatories, Mac Deering and a quiet German rancher named Vogt, who spoke little but whose signature had been among the first. Hargreave presented Blackwell's position first. The easement was legal. It had been properly filed. The property acquisitions were the ordinary business activity of a man engaged in agricultural development in the county, and the complainant's objections amounted to an attempt to restrict a property owner's legal right to utilize his legally acquired easements. He made it sound very reasonable. He was good at making things sound reasonable. Then Clara spoke. She had written her portion out and practiced it. Not because she needed notes, but because writing it had helped her understand the cleanest way to say it. She laid out the acquisition pattern clearly. The properties, the timing, the geographic relationship of each acquisition to the 1871 water agreement, the downstream easement filed in August. She did not use the word scheme. She used the word pattern, which was more accurate and less dismissible. The complainants are not objecting to Mr. Blackwell's right to own property or to utilize easements, she said. They are objecting to the cumulative effect of a specific pattern of acquisitions that, taken together, would give a single private party effective control over a water resource that the 1871 county agreement specifically established as a shared resource for the benefit of multiple property holders. She looked at Commissioner Hayes directly. The question before this hearing is not whether any single transaction was legal. Each one may well have been. The question is whether the county's 1871 agreement remains meaningful if one party can systematically acquire the positions necessary to nullify it. Hargreave objected to the characterization. Blackwell, who was sitting at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of a man exercising considerable self-control, said nothing. Hayes asked questions. He asked them of both sides, methodically, with the careful attention of a man determined to understand what he was actually looking at rather than what he was being told to see. He asked Elias about the water dependence of his operation. He asked Pritchard how the creek fed his stock. He asked Vogt, through Connolly, who spoke enough German to translate, about the upstream flow patterns in dry summers. It took 4 hours. Clara had expected 3 and was glad she'd brought food. At the end of it, Hayes said he would take the matter under advisement and deliver a written determination within 20 days. He said it without indicating which direction the determination would go, which was either scrupulous fairness or a very good performance of it. In the hallway afterward, Hargreave said something quietly to Blackwell that Clara couldn't hear. Blackwell looked across the hallway at her, a long, level look, the most direct look he had given her since the train station, and then he put on his hat and walked out. Pritchard appeared beside her. "You did well in there," he said. "Hayes'll go which way he goes," she said. "Maybe, but Blackwell knows now that whatever he tries next, there are 6 names on a county document. That changes what he tries next." He looked at her sideways. "Ward's a lucky man." "Ward's a capable man," Clara said. "He was managing a difficult situation alone for 14 months. He needed a second pair of eyes, not luck." Pritchard made the sound of a man receiving a correction he found fair. "Fair enough," he said, and went to find his horse. Potet. The determination came 17 days later, in the first week of January, in a letter addressed to Elias Ward and the co-complainants. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Elias standing behind her and Lucy, who had come down early and was pretending to eat her breakfast while actually watching Clara's face. Hayes had sided with the complainants on the easement. The August easement was ruled inconsistent with the terms of the 1871 water agreement and was voided pending Blackwell's right of appeal within 45 days. Additionally, Hayes had recommended, not mandated but recommended, that the county commissioner's office establish clear language around the 1871 agreement to prevent similar conflicts in the future. Clara set the letter down on the table. "Well," Elias said. "He can appeal," she said. "I know. But an appeal is expensive and public, And the case he'd be making is essentially that he should be allowed to do what the hearing already established he was trying to do. That's a harder argument. You think he won't appeal? She thought about it. I think he'll calculate whether the cost of the appeal is worth what he gets at the end of it, and I think the answer is probably no. He needed the quiet version of this to work. The loud version is more expensive than the prize. She looked at the letter again. But I've been wrong about what men like that will do before. Mama, said May from the doorway, where she had appeared at some point during this conversation in her nightgown with her hair still loose. What does the letter say? Clara looked at Elias. He looked at her. It says we won, he said. May appeared to consider whether this required more information. She decided it did not. Is there porridge? She said. There's porridge, Clara said, and got up. The blizzard came in late January, which was not a surprise. January in Kansas was always a negotiation with the weather, and this year the winter had been building toward something for weeks, the cold getting progressively meaner, the sky taking on the particular flat white quality that experienced people in that part of the country understood as a warning. Clara had been watching it and had stocked accordingly. Extra wood racked along the south side of the barn, the root cellar full, water barrels topped in the house and in the barn, extra hay laid in for the cattle. She had done all of this without making a production of it, in the same quiet, methodical way she did most things, and Elias had noticed and added to what she'd done without comment, and together they had prepared for something they both knew was coming. What she hadn't prepared for, what no amount of practical foresight could have prepared her for, because it was not a practical problem until it was Elias going to the barn in the middle of it. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening. It came fast, the way bad Kansas blizzards came, not gradually, but as if a door had opened somewhere to the north, and everything that had been held back was suddenly released all at once. By full dark, the wind was a physical force, and the snow was moving horizontal, and the house was the whole world. Clara had the girls in the main room with the stove built up. May was asleep on the settee by 8 o'clock, the way small children sleep through crises, completely and without awareness of being admired for it. Lucy was awake, sitting very straight in the chair nearest the stove with a book in her lap that she was not reading. Clara was at the window, which showed her nothing except white and motion. Elias had gone to the barn at 7 to check on the cattle. He had said he'd be 20 minutes. By 8:30, he wasn't back. She waited until 9. She watched the window and the clock, and she told herself there were 10 reasonable explanations for why a man checking on cattle in a blizzard might take longer than expected, and she went through all 10 of them in order and then went through them again, and by 9 she had run out of reasonable explanations that felt convincing. She was aware of Lucy watching her. "He's fine," Lucy said. Her voice was very flat. "I know," Clara said. "He knows the barn." "He does. He's probably waiting for it to ease before he comes back." Clara looked at the girl, at the too straight back and the book she wasn't reading, and the voice that was doing everything it could to stay controlled. And she understood that Lucy was not reassuring her. Lucy was managing the situation the way she always managed situations, by taking responsibility for the emotional temperature of a room, by working to make things stable because she had learned that if she didn't do it, no one would. She was 9 years old, and she had been doing this since her mother died, and Clara had told herself months ago that she was going to stop letting Lucy do it, and had not quite figured out how. "Lucy," she said. "What?" "Put the book down." A pause. Lucy put the book on the side table. "Come here." Another pause, shorter. Lucy got up from the chair and came to stand beside her at the window. Clara put an arm around her shoulders, and Lucy was stiff for a moment, the stiffness of a child who hasn't been held in a while and has to remember how. And then she leaned in slightly, just enough to let the weight of her rest against Clara's side. "He's going to be all right," Clara said. "You don't know that," Lucy said. "No, but I'm going to make sure of it." She kept her arm around Lucy's shoulders for another moment. "I need you to stay with May. Can you do that?" Lucy pulled back and looked at her. Her face was doing what it always did. The careful containing, the management, but under it Clara could see the plainness of the fear. "You're going out there." "I'm going to the barn." "It's a blizzard." "I know. I need you here with May." She held Lucy's gaze. This is the most important job. If May wakes up and I'm not here and you're not here, she'll be frightened. You're who she needs to see." She could see Lucy doing the calculation. Not whether she was frightened, which she clearly was, but whether this was a thing she could do, whether she was enough for this piece of it. The answer she arrived at was the one Clara had expected. "Don't get lost," Lucy said. "I won't get lost." She went to the back room and got the rope. It was a long coil, the heaviest one, and she tied one end to the iron ring in the kitchen wall that had been used for exactly this purpose by whoever built the house. They had known what Kansas winters were, the people who built this house. She tied the other end around her waist. She put on every layer she owned, the coat and the wool shawl under it, and the gloves that were not quite warm enough but were the warmest she had. She opened the back door and the storm came in like a wall. She went into it. She could not see. That was the first fact. Not barely see or see dimly, but genuinely could not see. The whiteness absolute and moving and directionless. She held the rope behind her with one hand and moved forward with the other hand out in front of her. And she put one foot in front of the other with the deliberate, consuming focus of a woman who had decided there was exactly one thing in the world right now, and that thing was moving forward. The wind was trying to take her sideways. She leaned into it and kept going. She found the barn wall with her outstretched hand, hit it hard enough to feel in her shoulder, and felt along it to the door and got the latch open and fell inside. The barn was dark and full of the noise of anxious cattle and the smell of hay and cold and animal warmth, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust to the interior dark after the exterior white, and when they did, she saw Elias on the ground near the far stall. She went to him. He was breathing. She could see the breath in the cold air, but he was not conscious, and when she got her hands under his arms and tried to lift, she understood that the only way this was happening was 1 inch at a time. She dragged him. There was no better word for it. She put her hands under his arms, and she dragged him across the barn floor toward the door, and it was slow, and it cost her more than she had expected, and she did not stop, because stopping was not a choice she was making tonight. He was heavier than she was, and the ground was not smooth, and the wind was fighting her every step of the way. But she had the rope, and she had the wall of the barn, and she had the line back to the house, and she put one foot in front of the other, and she kept going. She did not think about anything except the next foot. This was a technique she had learned without being taught. In the years of managing things alone, the years of early mornings and late nights, and problems that didn't have clean solutions, you did not think about the whole distance. You thought about the next foot. The cold was serious by the time she got him to the house door. Her hands had lost most of their feeling. She got the door open and pulled him through, and Lucy was there. Lucy had been there, had heard the door, had come without being called, and together they got him inside and onto the kitchen floor near the stove. May was awake. She was standing in the doorway from the main room with her eyes very wide, and she did not cry, which Clara would remember later as one of the most striking things about the whole night. May, who cried freely in ordinary circumstances, standing absolutely still and watching with her eyes wide, as if she understood that right now the situation required stillness. "Get blankets," Clara told Lucy. "Top shelf in the back room, all of them." Lucy went. May came to stand beside Clara and put her small hand on Elias's arm and said nothing, and Clara worked on getting him warm, and the stove ticked and the storm beat at the windows and the rope was still tied around her waist, and she didn't untie it for another 20 minutes because she kept forgetting it was there. Elias Ward opened his eyes at some point between midnight and 1 in the morning. The girls were both asleep by then, May on the settee again, Lucy in the chair, and Clara was sitting on the kitchen floor beside him because the floor was where she had sat down when she stopped moving and she hadn't found a reason to get up. He looked at the ceiling first, then he turned his head and looked at her. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough. "I'm here." "What?" "You were in the barn. You fell." She didn't know why he'd fallen, and it didn't matter tonight. "The storm's still up. Don't move." He was quiet for a moment. "You came out in it?" "Yes." "With the rope?" "Yes." He looked at the ceiling again. She watched his face, the slow return of awareness, the taking in of where he was and what had happened, the particular expression of a person who has just understood something about their own life that they didn't know before. "You dragged me," he said. "I did." "From the barn." "Elias." "Don't move."
He turned his head back to look at her. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no category for. Not relief, not gratitude, not any of the things she might have expected. It was something simpler than any of those. Something that had no performance in it at all. "Clara," he said. "What?" "Thank you." She looked at him on the kitchen floor with the blankets over him and the fire going and the storm at the windows, and she thought about the train platform and the gold coin and the boarding house and the ride out here on Bess in the gray September morning. And she thought about Lucy at the table with her arithmetic and May's curtains and the ledger in the lamplight and the county hearing room and Ruth Garrett's map and all the work still ahead of them, the north pasture and the south fence and the spring market and whatever Blackwell decided to do next. She thought about all of it, and she said, "Go to sleep." He almost smiled. Then he closed his eyes, and she sat beside him on the kitchen floor and listened to the storm work itself out against the house, and she did not move until morning. Blackwell did not appeal. The 45-day window came and went in the middle of February, quiet as a door closing in an empty room. No letter arrived from a Wichita lawyer. No rider came to the ranch. Claire had watched the calendar with the specific attention of someone who knows better than to assume a thing is finished until the deadline has actually passed. And when it did pass, she noted it and said nothing to anyone until that evening at supper, when she mentioned it the same way she might mention that the supply run was done or the water barrel was full. "The appeal window closed yesterday," she said. Elias looked up from his plate. "I know." May looked up too with the expression of someone who has been following a long story and is trying to determine if this is the ending. "Does that mean the bad man is done?" "It means he's done with this particular thing," Clara said. "Will he try something else?" "Maybe," Clara said, "but probably not the same thing. And if he tries something new, we'll deal with that when it comes." May appeared to find this reasonable. Lucy said nothing, which meant she had already arrived at the same conclusion and didn't feel it needed restating. Elias picked up his fork again. "Pass the potatoes," he said, and that was the end of Gideon Blackwell as a central preoccupation of the Ward Ranch. He did try something else, as it turned out, but it was smaller than what he'd attempted before, and it confirmed what Clara had told Elias that night on the kitchen floor. He was a man who operated best in the dark, and the dark had been taken from him. Word came through Ruth Garrett in March that Blackwell had attempted to purchase a controlling interest in the Abilene Cattle Buyers Cooperative, which would have given him informal leverage over market access for the whole county's ranchers. The attempt failed when 3 existing cooperative members declined to sell their stakes, apparently having been quietly advised by someone who understood the implications. Ruth didn't say who had done the advising. She didn't need to. Clara heard this report at Ruth's counter in mid-March and said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ruth said. "It was Connolly who talked to the cooperative members. I just knew which ones to send him to." "All right, thank Connolly." "Connolly doesn't like being thanked either." Ruth began wrapping Clara's supplies. "How's the north pasture line coming?" "Finished last week. We're running a test section of cattle through the new pasture now." Ruth looked up. "You got it done before the spring thaw?" "Barely. The last 20 yards were difficult. We hit a shelf of limestone and had to go around it. But it's in." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She had a way of being quiet that was not absence, but presence. The quiet of a person paying close attention. "You've added 100 acres of usable range," she said. "More or less. That changes the numbers for the spring market considerably." "That's the idea," Clara said. Ruth finished wrapping the supplies and set them on the counter, and looked at Clara with the direct, unhurried look she had given her on that first September day, when Clara had walked into a dry goods store with a suitcase at her feet and nothing else, and asked for work. "You know," she said, "I've lived in this county for 22 years, and I've watched a lot of people arrive and a lot of people leave, and I have a fairly reliable sense of which is which from early on." She paused. "I knew when you walked in here in September." Clara looked at her. "I knew you were staying," Ruth said. "I could see it. I don't know if you could." Clara thought about that honestly. "I don't know if I could either," she said. "Not on that day." "And now?" She thought about the kitchen floor and the rope and the cold, She thought about Lucy's arithmetic and May's curtains, worn to nothing, and then replaced and now faded again in that particular sun-faded way that means a window gets good light. She thought about Elias at the property line in February, pointing at the new fence posts and saying that'll hold with the quiet certainty of a man who has learned to believe in things he has built himself. Now I can, she said. What? They married in April, when the ground was soft enough to grow things again, and the cottonwoods by the creek were putting out their first tentative leaves. It was not a large event because neither of them was inclined toward large events, and because the people who mattered already knew and didn't require an occasion to demonstrate it. Ruth Garrett came. Miss Hallie came and sat beside Lucy throughout with the particular sensitivity of a woman who understood that this day was complicated for a 9-year-old, even a 9-year-old who wanted it, and that what Lucy needed most was someone sitting with her who didn't need her to perform a feeling. Dale Pritchard came with his wife, a quiet woman named Edna, who had brought a pie without announcing she was going to, which Clara found more touching than most deliberate gestures. Connolly came and stood in the back and left before the food was served, which was entirely in character and therefore somehow appropriate. May wore her good dress and lost a ribbon from her hair within the first 20 minutes and didn't appear to notice or care. Lucy wore her good dress and kept the ribbons in and stood very straight, and at one point, during the quiet of the official vows, reached sideways and took Clara's hand briefly, just for a moment, just the squeeze of a small, dry hand before releasing it, and Clara felt that small pressure in her chest long after the hand was gone. There was no dramatic declaration. There was no sweeping gesture. There was just the two of them, and the people who had seen the shape of the thing and come to mark it, and the cottonwoods moving in the April wind and the ranch looking exactly like what it was. A working place in the middle of its work, not paused or dressed up, just present. Elias said his vows with the same quality he brought to everything he meant, directly, without ornamentation, his eyes on her face. Clara said hers the same way. Whatever she had imagined about marriage years ago in Philadelphia, it had not looked like this. This was better than what she had imagined, in the way that real things are almost always better than imagined ones. Not because they're more comfortable, but because they're true. The spring cattle drive to Wichita brought the best price Elias had gotten in 4 years. Part of it was the market recovering slightly from the previous year's lows. Part of it was the additional weight the cattle had put on with access to the North Pasture's better grass. Clara had calculated the expected return 3 times in the weeks before the drive, and the actual number when Elias came home from Wichita came in above even her optimistic estimate by a margin that surprised her, which did not happen often. She was in the kitchen when he came back. She heard the wagon and came out to the porch and looked at his face, which told her everything before he said a word. "Well," she said. "South fence," he said. "All of it." "All of it?" "Full replacement, and enough left over to start on the northwest line before winter." He climbed down from the wagon and looked up at her on the porch. "You were right about the North Pasture." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "You could let me say it." "You said it." She came down the porch steps. "South fence and the northwest start. What about the equipment for the second water line section?" "Next year, if the fall market holds." "The fall market will hold." "You don't know that." "I know the numbers, and the numbers say it'll hold." She took the horse's bridle from him. "Go see the girls. May's been watching the road since noon." He went. She put the horse up, and when she came back in, May had already extracted a detailed account of the entire trip from him, and Lucy was asking targeted questions about the Wichita stockyards that suggested she had been thinking about them more than she had indicated. The kitchen was warm, and the stove was going, and supper was almost ready, and the particular noise of that room, May's voice and Lucy's questions and Elias's patient answers, was a noise that Clara had not known she was waiting for until it was there. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and listened to it. Not sentimentally. She was not a sentimental woman, had never had the luxury of it, but with the honest attention she gave to things that mattered. This mattered. She knew it in the same direct, inarguable way she knew the things she knew. The south fence needed replacement. The north pasture line had been worth digging. This family was worth building. She went in and stirred the pot and said, "May, get the plates." So, there is a thing that happens to people who have spent a long time being looked at wrongly. It doesn't disappear overnight when circumstances change. It doesn't lift cleanly. It settles gradually, the way mud settles in water. Not gone, but lower, not clouding everything the way it used to. Clara understood this about herself. She was not naive about it. The years of her face being the first thing in a room that people saw, and the first thing they recalibrated away from, had done something to her that careful attention and a good life wouldn't entirely undo. She knew that. She didn't expect otherwise. What she didn't expect was the specific form the settling would take. It came in small ways over that first year and then the second. It came in the form of the Connolly's eldest daughter, who arrived at the ranch one afternoon with a practical problem about her family's accounts and said, plainly and without introduction, "Mama said you'd know what to do," as if this were information she had grown up with. It came in the form of Bert Sykes at the recorder's office, who had started treating her with the particular careful respect of a man who has recalibrated his initial assessment and is slightly embarrassed about what it had been. It came in the form of Dale Pritchard telling a newcomer rancher at the feed store in Clara's hearing, "You want to understand water rights in this county, go talk to Ward's wife." Not Ward's wife, who manages the house. Not any qualifier, just Ward's wife. As if that were enough. She heard that and she thought about the train platform. She thought about Gideon Blackwell's face when he first looked at her and the decision she had watched him make in that moment, the decision that she was not worth the trouble of his original words. She thought about the gold coin spinning on the boards and the 40 people watching and the particular quality of a public humiliation, which is that it happens in front of witnesses, and witnesses remember. They remembered something else now. She did not think this had made things right or even. She was not 12 years old, and she did not believe the world corrected its errors with any particular reliability. What she believed, what she had come to understand, not from a book or a lesson, but from the specific education of her own life, was that the world's opinion of you is not the same thing as your opinion of yourself, and the two are not as connected as people spend enormous amounts of energy assuming they are. Gideon Blackwell had looked at her face and decided she was worth less than he had contracted for. That had been his assessment. It had been wrong, not because her face was different than what he saw, but because he was looking at the wrong thing and measuring with the wrong instrument, and the error was his. And she had known it was his error even on the day he made it, standing on that platform with everything she owned in a suitcase at her feet. She had known it. That was the thing she wanted to say, if she ever found the right way to say it. To whoever needed to hear it, May someday, Lucy sooner, the Connolly's daughter maybe, whoever came to the kitchen table with a problem that required this particular truth. You do not need to wait for the world to correct its assessment of you in order to know the assessment was wrong. You can know it yourself, immediately, in real time, before anyone else catches up. It is a hard thing to know. It does not make you comfortable. It does not protect you from the cost of being seen wrongly in public. And that cost is real, and she would not minimize it. But it means you do not spend your life waiting for permission to be what you already are. Elias told her something in June of that second year that she thought about for a long time afterward. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become the form their evenings took when the work allowed it. The girls inside, the ranch quiet, the June sky doing the thing it did in Kansas, where the color just kept deepening and deepening as if it had decided to see how far it could go. He had been quiet for a while, the particular quiet that meant he was working towards something, and she had let him work. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right. I want to tell you about when I first saw you, on the platform." She looked at him. I wasn't there by chance," he said. "I'd gone to meet the train because I'd heard Blackwell was expecting a mail-order bride, and I don't know exactly what I was doing there. Watching, I suppose. The way you watch something you know is going to go wrong." He stopped. I'd seen Blackwell do things like this before. Lead with a certain version of himself and then pull it back when it cost him something. "You knew he would reject her," Clara said. "Me?" "I thought he might. I didn't know." "Why were you watching?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I'd been thinking for a while that I needed help. Real help, not the occasional hand from a neighbor. And I'd been thinking about a woman, a particular kind of woman, not a specific woman, just the idea of the qualities I'd need if anyone was going to come to this ranch and make it work." He looked at the darkening sky. "And then I saw you step off the train." "Before any of it happened."
before any of it happened. You came down those steps and you looked around the platform with this. You looked at it like you were taking inventory, like you were already assessing it." He paused. "And then I watched what happened, and I watched you give the coin back, and I thought, yes, that's her." Clara sat with this for a while. "You could have said that on the boarding house porch," she said. "I could have. It would have sounded strange." "It does sound strange now." "I know." He glanced at her sideways. "Do you mind?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about whether it changed anything. The way he had seen her before she had known she was being seen. The quality of that looking, what it had been looking for, and what it had found. She turned it over and examined it. "No," she said. "I don't mind." "Because?" "Because you weren't looking at my face," she said. "You were looking at what I did." He nodded slowly. "That's it exactly." The sky had gone the color of something between blue and nothing, and the first stars were coming out over the flat land to the east. And from inside the house came the sounds of May refusing to go to bed and Lucy firmly explaining why she needed to, a negotiation that had been occurring every night for as long as Clara could remember and would presumably continue until May was old enough to decide it herself. Clara listened to it and felt the truth of where she was. Not the comfortable, rounded truth of a thing finished, but the honest, ongoing truth of a thing that was still happening, still being built, still requiring work in the morning. The south fence was being replaced. The north pasture was running cattle. The books were better than they had been in 4 years. Blackwell was somewhere doing whatever Blackwell did now, diminished by light and documentation, and the county records had 6 names on a document that had changed what was possible in this valley. And she was here, on this porch, in this June dark, beside this man, in this life she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not now trade for anything she had imagined instead. She had come to Kansas with one idea of what her life was going to be, and that idea had been thrown at her feet like a gold coin, and she had left it there, because what it represented was not worth picking up. What she had instead was not perfect. It was not easy. There were mornings when the work was too much and the money was still tighter than she wanted, and she missed her mother with an ache that didn't diminish with time, just changed shape. There were days when Lucy was unreachable in her own private worry, and Clara could not find the door in. There were nights when the wind was bad, and the ranch felt very small against the size of the Kansas dark. But she was not waiting for anything. She was not hoping that someday something would arrive and make it real. It was real right now, in the specifics of it. The stove in the morning, the ledger at night, May's hand in hers walking to the barn, Elias beside her on the porch watching the stars come out one at a time over a piece of land that was theirs, that they had held and were going to keep holding, one season at a time, one problem at a time, together. That was what she knew about worth. It was not conferred. It was not something a man's approval could give you or take away. It was made the same way you made anything that lasted, by showing up every day to the work of it and doing the work, and refusing to put down what you had decided to carry. May's voice rose inside the house, indignant about something, and Clara and Elias both heard it at the same moment, and both almost smiled at the same moment, the small, involuntary kind. "She's not going to sleep," Elias said. "She never does," Clara said. "She just eventually runs out of argument." "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe 15 if Lucy's persuasive. He nodded. They sat and listened to the argument wind down the way arguments did when one party was 9 and the other was 12 and possessed of superior stubbornness. The stars continued to arrive. The cottonwoods by the creek moved in the warm June wind. The ranch was quiet in the particular way of a place that is resting between one day's work and the next. Not finished, not permanent, but solid. The way good things are solid. Not because nothing can touch them, but because they were built to take the weight. Eventually the house went quiet. Eventually Clara and Elias went inside. The lamp burned for another hour, and then it didn't, and the Ward Ranch settled into the dark Kansas night the same as it always had, plain and imperfect and exactly enough.